Hey there folks, Graham here. Welcome to the channel and welcome to another episode of Ultimate Guides. Today bringing you the KORG Polysix VST. This synth has been around since 2004 but received a major revamp in 2020 along with KORG's other VSTs. It's available individually or as part of the KORG collection, which contains a whole host of KORG's other finest offerings, all of which I will be reviewing on this channel in the future, so please stay tuned for those. But for now, let's dive in to the Polysix. So let's begin with the VCO, or voltage controlled oscillator section. To begin with, we have a vibrato dial. This affects how much vibrato you get when you use the modulation wheel. So for example, at 0, there's no vibrato. At about 4, there's a mild vibrato, and at 10, we get the full vibrato. There's a simple 3-step octave switch, 3 waveforms, a sawtooth, a pulse width, which is effectively a square, and a pulse width modulation waveform, which is effectively another square, but it does do some different things. There's then a pulse width and pulse width modulation dial. What this does is this narrows the width of the pulse width, effectively thinning the sound. So on the pulse width waveform we get this effect, thinning it until it effectively disappears, and under pulse width modulation we get this effect. The pulse width modulation speed dial only affects the pulse width modulation waveform, and it determines the speed of the modulation, like this. And finally, there's a sub-oscillator, which can be set 1 octave or 2 octaves below the main oscillator. So here's without the sub-oscillator, 1 octave below, 2 octaves below. Next up is the VCF, or voltage controlled filter section. Here we have the cutoff frequency, the resonance, the envelope generator intensity, which determines how much the envelope generator affects the cutoff frequency, and keyboard tracking, which affects how much the cutoff frequency will change determining on the pitch of the note played. So at 0 we get this, and at maximum setting we get this. Next to the VCF, there's then a VCA, or voltage controlled amplifier section. There's a VCA mode switch. If this is set to EG, then the notes will follow whatever the settings are in the envelope generator. So with a fairly long release, as I've got set here. But if it's set to gate mode, notes will cut off immediately. And then there's the attenuator, which is like a secondary volume switch. Moving on down, we then have the EG, or envelope generator section, with the standard attack, decay, sustain and release knobs. The attack dial determines how much it takes for the note to effectively reach its full volume. So at full attack, we get full volume straight away, but if I set it to say halfway, the note slowly rises to its maximum volume. The decay and sustain knobs then effectively work in tandem. The sustain knob determines what volume will be sustained if you hold the note down, and the decay knob determines how long it takes from its initial volume for it to decay to the sustain volume, if that makes sense. So for example, if I set the sustain volume relatively low and set the decay to about halfway, so when we hit the key, we'll initially get full volume, which will then decay slowly to the lower sustain volume. And then that lower volume will be maintained for as long as I hold the key. And then we have the release dial, set to 0. Notes cut off immediately I release the key. Set to higher levels, the note will continue to sound after I've released the key. And then next to the envelope generator, we have the main output. So we have a pan to move the sound from left to right. And we have the main volume output. These first 5 sections then cover the main sound generation, filters, envelopes and amplification, but now let's look at modulation, effects and some of the other functionality. So we now come to the MG or Modulation Generator section. Starting with the dials, we have a frequency dial which affects the speed or frequency of the modulation. We then have a delay which determines how long it takes for the modulation to start taking effect, and we have a level which sets the depth of the modulation, how much it will impact the sound. Next to this we then have 3 modes, so the modulation can affect the oscillators, or it can affect the cutoff frequency, or it can affect the amplification. As an example, in VCO mode we can get this sort of effect, and if I bring the delay in, we get a clean tone, and then the modulation comes in slightly after. I can adjust the speed of this modulation. And I can increase the depth of this modulation. I can do the same with cutoff frequency. So I've set the cutoff frequency to just over half, and I get this sort of effect. I can increase the level. And I can increase or decrease the speed. And of course, like previously, I can bring in a delay. So again, I get the clean tone, and then the modulation comes in slightly after. And I can do exactly the same thing with amplification. There's then a tempo switch. If this is off, then the frequency dial will control the speed of the modulation. If this is turned on, then the tempo will sync to the tempo within your DAW, and you can speed it up, slow it down, or split it using the standard sort of half, quarter, eighth, 16th note intervals. And then there's a key switch which determines whether or not the modulation cycle is reset each time you press a note. So with the key switch off, what will happen is as I play notes, for example up a scale, the modulation cycle will start and it will continue to run as I'm playing the notes. So for example, I get this sort of effect. Each of the notes I'm playing are being affected by the modulation cycle. But if I turn the key switch on with a slight delay and play the scale, it's only the last note when I hold it that gets the modulation, because every time I hit a key, the modulation cycle is being reset and therefore the delay is restarting. And that's the modulation generator section. Next up we have the arpeggiator section. First off, there is an on-off button which effectively turns the arpeggiator on and off. We have a key button. If this is turned on, then every time you press a key, the ARP cycle will be reset. And we have a tempo button. If this is turned on, the tempo of the ARP will sync with the tempo in your DAW, and then using the bass note section here, you have the usual half, quarter, eighth, etc. intervals. And with the sync button turned off, you can control the speed of the ARP using the speed dial. So for example, you can then play the ARP over 1 octave, 2 octaves, or the full range of the keyboard. You can then set the ARP to play up from the lowest note to the highest note, down from the highest note to the lowest note, or up and down, which is a sort of a circular ARP. And then there's an on-off latch. Off, then the ARP will only play while you're holding the keys, and stops as soon as you release them. On, you can trigger your ARP, and when you release the keys, the ARP will continue to play. And that's the arpeggiator section. Moving across from the arpeggiator section, we have a basic effect section. So off, we get this, or we can have a chorus, or a phaser, or an ensemble. And for each of these, we can adjust the spread and the intensity. So on the ensemble, it really widens the sound, and also we can adjust the speed. And then next to this effects section, we have the pitch control section. So the first dial up is the bend range. So if I set this to 0, the pitch bend wheel on my synthesizer, it's not a wheel actually, it's a slider, but this pitch bend slider does nothing. But if I set it to 12, then the pitch bender operates over a full octave. There's then a transpose switch, where I can transpose the key of the keyboard up and down, and finally a fine tuning switch, which can come in handy if you want to sometimes slightly detune the synth for certain effects. Delving deeper into modulation, we then have the external modulation section. In here we have 4 things that we can use for modulation. We can modulate the pulse width of either the PW or PWM waveforms. We can modulate the cutoff frequency. We can modulate the amplification gain, and we can modulate the depth or level that's coming from the modulation generator. Each of these can be assigned to a source over here. So for example, velocity, pressure, so aftertouch, the pitch bend wheel, the modulation wheel, or indeed any other MIDI CC command that you want. So as an example, I've got the cutoff set to the maximum, and I've assigned it to the modulation wheel. Now when I press a note, I can modulate the cutoff frequency using the mod wheel. And I can do the same, as I say, for the others, the pulse width, the gain, or the modulation generator level. But that's not all. I can assign a second source. Therefore, I can have 2 modulation sources running in tandem. So if in addition to controlling the cutoff frequency with the modulation wheel, I wanted to control the VCA gain with the aftertouch on my keyboard, I can. So for example, here's the cutoff frequency. And then with the aftertouch, I can control the VCA gain. We're nearly there, just a few more sections to go. Moving on down to the bottom, we have the key assign mode. We have a hold button for holding notes after you've released them. So with the hold button off, but with the hold button on, the notes continue to sound and will hold after I've pressed the key. We then have a chord button for programming chords to be played by one key. So if I turn this on and then press a chord, I can now play that with one key. There's then a unison, which is effectively a mono mode, but you can stack voices on top of one another. So for example, this is one note in unison, or this is 32 notes in unison. And we then have a standard poly mode. Next to these buttons we then have some voice settings. So the bottom one is the total polyphony, so you can have up to 32 voices playing polyphonically. And the unison is how many voices are stacked in unison when playing polyphonically. So for example, this is one voice unison played polyphonically. And this is 8 voices stacked playing polyphonically. What you need to remember with this function is dependent on how many voices you've chosen under unison will affect your polyphony. So with 8 voices stacked together, that reduces my polyphony from 32 notes to 4 notes, because I'm playing 4 times 8, which equals 32. So an important thing to remember, otherwise you will get note dropouts if you try to play large chords or complex pieces polyphonically whilst using a high unison voice count. And we then have 3 dials, a unison detune, which effectively detunes each of the individual voices, so they're effectively slightly out of tune from one another. For this effect, or the unison spread, which effectively, for example, spreads the notes of the chords between the left and right channels. So if I play a 4-note chord, it widens up the sound by spreading it out to the left and right channels. And then finally, there's an analog dial, which effectively introduces a sort of a randomness to the pitch as you play notes, to give maybe that sort of authentic analog drift that you may get where analog synths potentially fall out of tune and come back into tune as they're playing, maybe dependent on temperature differences in the studio that you're playing in. And then finally on the main panel here we have the effects section. We can have 2 sets of effects running simultaneously, and under the effects section we have compressors, limiters, we have talking modulators, decimators, the Polysix ensemble, stereo delays, reverbs, distortion, etc. Quite a selection, 21 in total, as you can see. For each of these effects that you open up, you'll come up with a set of controls. So for example, I've turned on the distortion. I've got 3 types of distortion, and then I've got a drive, a tone, and a mix control. So if I go to, say, type 3, this is without the distortion. This is with the distortion. And as I say, if you choose another effect, for example, the phaser, then you get a whole host of controls for the phaser, in which you can set the left and right phase, the resonance, the depth, the frequency rate, etc. of the phaser effect. And so on for all the other effects. They all have their own individual controls. And as I say, you can have them set simultaneously. So we could have a phaser going with, for example, our distortion effect, such as this. Completing the synth then, we have a toolbar across the top where you can save presets that you've made yourself, any patches that you've made yourself. You can navigate through the available presets. So if I bring on this, or click on this I should say, it brings up a menu of all the different presets and how they're categorized. I can move along the presets one by one using the arrows here, or I can use this navigation menu to go through a list of all the presets. Any patches you make yourself can be saved into this list of presets versus the relevant categories. And then over to the right, there's the settings cogwheel, which opens up some of the main master settings for the synthesizer. And finishing everything off, we then have an 88 key bed at the bottom, along with a pitch bend and modulation wheel. These can either be activated using a mouse, as I'm doing now, and I can move the mod wheel with my mouse, or the pitch wheel with my mouse, or indeed they give a visual display of what you're playing on your keyboard. And that, everybody, is the KORG Polysix. Thanks for watching. I hope you have enjoyed this video and found it useful. If you have, please don't forget to like, subscribe and ring that bell, as it really does help me to continue to make more videos for you like this. And don't forget, I will be reviewing the remainder of VSTs in the KORG collection in future videos, so stay tuned for those. If you've got any questions at all on anything that's been in this video, then please feel free to leave them in the comments section and I will get back to each and every one of you. And indeed, if you have any other comments, please feel free to leave them. All feedback is really greatly appreciated. Anyhow, that's it for now. I've been Graham. Thanks for watching. Take care and catch you later.